Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or the guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's August 21st, and we have a lot to talk about. My guest on today's podcast is Shawn Feliciano. Shawn is an MS warrior. She was diagnosed with MS in 2009, and in 2012, Shawn decided to challenge herself and raise awareness about multiple sclerosis by hiking 817 miles from Utah to Arizona. This wasn't a walk in the park. This hike challenged Shawn in ways that she really hadn't planned on. I'm looking forward to my conversation with Shawn Feliciano, but before we talk to Shawn, there are a few other things that you should know about. If you're a regular RealTalk MS listener, then you've heard me talk about how important it is to begin disease-modifying therapy. And the sooner you begin taking those MS prescription medications, the more it might benefit you in the long run. Well, a study of just over 1,700 MS patients over an 18-year period suggests that if you've been diagnosed with relapsing remitting MS, then this is a piece of advice that you really want to pay attention to. Because this study suggests that long-term treatment with MS disease-modifying therapy lessens the risk of the disease worsening among people with relapsing remitting MS. Now, unfortunately, the study points out that this benefit doesn't extend to people who've already been diagnosed with secondary progressive MS. And in the study, researchers analyzed data available for 1,709 MS patients registered at the Group for Research and Treatment of Multiple Sclerosis Registry in Valencia, Spain. The study participants were evaluated every 3 or 6 months for changes in their EDSS score. Remember, that's the Expanded Disability Status Scale that neurologists use to measure disability. They were also evaluated for their relapse rate and any side effects from or decisions to stop their disease-modifying therapy. These patients were followed for just over 18 years, and in that time, about 36% of the patients with relapsing remitting MS progressed to secondary progressive MS. Statistically, this was good news when it was compared with 58% or 66% of the patients whose disease progressed to secondary progressive MS in 2 other independent studies. In other words, when they were compared with other groups of relapsing remitting MS patients, a much smaller percentage of the study participants who stayed on their disease-modifying therapy saw their MS progress to secondary progressive MS. Now, in some cases, the study participants who were on a disease-modifying therapy changed to another disease-modifying therapy, but they stayed on course in terms of taking an MS prescription medication. So the good news coming out of this study is that long-term treatment with disease-modifying therapy might reduce the number of MS patients who ultimately develop secondary progressive MS. But among the patients in the study who did progress to secondary progressive MS, it was also shown that these disease-modifying therapies had no effect. And that's why it's so important to people living with secondary progressive MS to know about the work of the International Progressive MS Alliance, where the entire research focus is on solving the riddle of progressive multiple sclerosis. You've heard me talk a lot about the Progressive MS Alliance. Full disclosure, it's my honor to be a member of the Alliance's Scientific Steering Committee. And the biggest reason that I launched this podcast was that the work that I saw being accomplished through the Alliance made me feel hopeful. And I wanted to make sure that I shared as much of that information as possible so that someone living with progressive MS might, maybe even for the first time, begin to feel hopeful. We haven't talked specifically about progressive MS and some of the research being done in that arena in a while, so that's something you can plan on hearing about in an upcoming podcast episode. But if you're interested in this study, I'll include a link in the show notes. And if you're living with progressive MS, while this study doesn't offer much in the way of encouragement, I'm also going to include a link to the International Progressive MS Alliance, where you can read about some of the important research that's currently underway in laboratories all around the world. Researchers at the School of Public Health at Curtin University, the University of Melbourne, and the Australian National University in Canberra have published a study that concludes that eating a diet high in vegetables and fish may reduce the risk of someone developing MS. It's fairly well accepted that there are environmental factors that play some sort of a role in whether someone develops MS, and this study explores whether diet might be one of those factors. So the researchers analyzed dietary data from a multi-center study that was conducted across Australia, and then determined whether a healthy diet or a Western-style diet had any sort of impact on the chances of someone suffering a demyelinating event. And as you know, demyelination is the calling card of multiple sclerosis. Well, the team found that a higher intake of healthy foods like vegetables and fish led to a 50% reduction in the risk of a demyelinating event when compared with individuals who had a much lower intake of these foods. Now, this information might prove to be helpful to people who are at higher risk of developing MS. For instance, there seems to be a genetic component to MS, and although that genetic component isn't fully understood, it might make sense for someone who has family members who are living with MS to pursue a healthier diet high in vegetables and fish. We don't know yet whether this will conclusively make a difference, but this initial research suggests that it certainly could, and it certainly couldn't hurt. If you'd like to know more about the details of this study, I'll include a link in today's show notes. When even the healthiest person doesn't sleep well, it impacts their cognitive ability. And if that otherwise healthy individual continues to have problems sleeping, it's naturally going to create an increasingly stressful situation for them. But this situation gets geometrically compounded when that person is not healthy, but is someone who's living with MS, because about half the people living with MS also report poor sleep quality. And living with the unpredictability of MS already creates a stressful situation. And finally, we know that about 50% of the people living with MS are also going to be diagnosed with depression. So researchers at Emory University and the University of Rochester wanted to look at these interrelated symptoms and circumstances to see whether perceived stress and sleep deficits affect an MS patient's perception of their own cognitive health and their depressive symptoms. The research team recruited 77 MS patients from a university-based MS clinic. 75 of these patients were white, 2 were multiracial, and 1 was black. And this patient group was comparable in gender and age to the MS population as a whole in the United States. The 77 study participants completed a self-reported measure of their cognitive skills, and this included skills like paying attention, memory, and the ability to plan. They also used a self-reporting tool that allowed them to track their sleep for a month, and they tracked how long it took them to fall asleep, how long they could sleep for, whether they awakened during the night, and whether they used any medication to help them sleep. The study participants also used a self-reporting questionnaire to report the level of stress they were feeling, and another self-reporting questionnaire to help determine the level of depression that they might be feeling. Well, when the information contained in all of these self-reporting tools was collected and analyzed, it suggested that those study participants with higher levels of perceived cognitive deficits also experienced poorer sleep quality and higher levels of perceived stress, all of which related to a higher level of depression. In other words, As people living with MS experience cognitive difficulties, it creates a higher level of stress that ends up affecting their ability to get a good night's sleep. And all of these factors can lead to depression. The takeaway from this study is that doctors can work with their patients on modifying their stress levels and improving their quality of sleep, which in turn may help mitigate someone sinking into clinical depression. And if you're interested in finding out more about this, I'll include a link to the study in today's show notes. A few weeks ago, I told you about a short film called Hidden. The 10-minute film was produced by Shift.ms, which is a social network created by people living with MS for people living with MS. And this film sets out to illustrate what it's like to live with and be affected by a disease with symptoms that can be largely unpredictable and often invisible. The National MS Society has also produced a short 3-minute video that I would describe as a collection of personal testimonials from a number of different people about the symptom-related challenges, but also the inner challenges of living with MS. And one of the things that makes these two short films interesting is the difference in the tone of the storytelling. In broad terms, both films are talking about the same thing, the personal challenge of living with multiple sclerosis. So it's interesting to see how they each approach the same theme quite differently. One of the films portrays people living with the uncertainty of MS as hopeful and resolute about their future, in spite of whatever set of symptoms or disease progression that they may be living with. The other film shows how living with MS can be depressing and even frightening. It's a much darker depiction of how someone with MS might respond to the uncertainty of the disease and its unpredictable symptoms. And what's really most interesting to me about looking at these two films is that I think they both get it right. In fact, I think we can even combine the very different storytelling tones found in each of these films and synthesize them into what I would call a 360-degree depiction of what it's like to live with MS. In other words, I don't think that the stories in each of these films represent an either-or reality or depiction of someone living with MS. I think that there are moments when the strong struggle and the fearful find inner strength. There are days when MS gets the better of you, not just in terms of your actual symptoms, but even in terms of how you define the reality of your own MS journey, how you look at your own future, how you feel about being someone who's living with MS. And there are other days when you thrive, certainly not because you have MS, but in spite of the fact that you have MS. Living your best life with MS isn't a one-battle war. It's a war with a continuing number of battles and skirmishes, some of which you win and some of which you may not. And maybe the most important thing about living your best life with MS is remembering that if you aren't winning today's battle, you can still win the one tomorrow. I'll include a link to both of these short films in today's show notes. And since we're talking about thriving in spite of MS, this seems like the ideal time to bring on my guest, Shawn Feliciano, because Shawn, in every sense of the word, is an MS warrior. In a moment, we'll talk to Shawn about what being an MS warrior means to her and why she went to extremes to prove it. One of the real perks of doing this podcast is that I get to talk with extraordinary people. On some episodes, it could be a world-class researcher who's in their lab working to unravel the riddle of MS. On other episodes, it might be an MS activist who's advocating for the kind of public and social policies that will empower people living with MS to live their best lives. And sometimes it's an MS warrior, someone who's fighting the battle on the front lines to ensure that the rest of the world better understands what it means to live with a disease for which there is no cure, a disease that at any given time may present a set of completely invisible but disabling symptoms, and a disease that, from moment to moment, may decide to progress. Well, my guest today is Shawn Feliciano. Shawn was diagnosed with MS in 2009, and in 2012, Shawn decided to raise awareness about MS by hiking 817 miles from Utah to Arizona. And this wasn't like clocking 817 miles around a nice, flat, well-manicured and temperature-controlled indoor track. If you check your Google Maps, you'll see this was a hike across a rocky desert. Shawn is an MS warrior. Welcome to the podcast, Shawn.
Thanks, John. It's absolutely great to be here.
Now, I know you were diagnosed in 2009. Can you share a little bit about what getting that diagnosis was like for you?
Absolutely. It's funny because being an advocate and a warrior, I've heard so many similar stories, and there was a lot of feeling of, okay, what is this? I was diagnosed with optic neuritis, so that was the first stage. And I was actually, it was about a month before my wedding, and I was in New York, where I'm originally from, and I was out for a run and just could not see, and then the optic neuritis actually set in. That's what was there. Had some tingling in my hand, and so when I was diagnosed, within actually a couple of days, I knew nothing about multiple sclerosis. If anything, it was a little embarrassing because I thought it was Jerry's kids. And I thought, once I started doing a little bit of research, I thought, there's absolutely no way that this could be happening to me. One, I'm getting married, I'm running a marathon, and I've always eaten well. I've always just been very active running and hiking. So it was absolutely shocking. And I know there are other people out there that have, and people that I've spoken to that have felt the same way that I felt at that moment, just numbness, disbelief, a little bit of just not accepting what medical testing is presenting in front of you.
So tell me, how do you go from being diagnosed with MS to deciding that what you really need to do is go on an 817-mile hike?
Well, there were a couple of reasons. I think once I got through the bereavement and things that a lot of us go through, I realized that I wasn't the only one going through this. That was one thing. But there were a lot of questions that I had that I wasn't getting answers to. And as a Latina, Hispanic, I wanted to know how MS affected other Latinos, or African Americans, or people from lower income areas, minorities. And so I think it was pretty much in my quest to try to find some answers for myself that I thought, there's got to be other people around that have the same questions. We're getting diagnosed with something that we know nothing of. Well, okay, so there's a lot of medications out there, but what about the emotional part of it? How does that affect other minorities? And so I think it was pretty much in this, for the Holy Grail, that I realized there are definitely other people out there that are feeling the same way that I feel. And okay, I know that, but then what can I do to bring exposure? What can I do to make a difference? And so I set out in a number of different ways, different ideas. Because of my running, I set out and I thought I could wear something orange, which is the MS color, and I could run some races in orange and raise awareness that way. Well, that actually didn't work. My husband and I, because he was a huge supporter, we thought of hiking the entire Grand Canyon, not from rim to rim, but like the whole thing. And I thought, this is great, but I want to die for a cause, but I don't want to die right now. And then we came up with, what kind of hikes can we do that are manageable and raise awareness. And if other people could join us, they actually could join us for like a very brief stint, or if they can hike, a few miles or 13 miles, whatever it might be, they're more than welcome to join us. And so it was a progression of ideas. And then ultimately, what we call the big hike came to fruition.
Yeah, I think a big hike is absolutely an appropriate term for that. So you mentioned you were kind of training for a marathon. You had already been running. So did your diagnosis impact your training or your fitness routine, or has it impacted your fitness routine at all?
It definitely did. I hit a wall where I kind of liken it to the going after or throughout the bereavement and sitting on the couch watching Oprah, which everybody who knows me knows that I never watch TV, and just sitting there kind of eating bonbons and watching soaps or Oprah, whatever it might have been, and then realizing that, all right, I can't deny what I have. This is what I have. And so I had to get up. I had to be me again. And that's what I was probably starving myself of, is I needed to shed that old life. I needed to embrace the new Shawn, the new me. And that included a little bit of my old life. And that included going out and running. But it was a wall that I had hit. And then once I actually realized, all right, stop feeling sorry for yourself, and this is what you need to do for you. This is what you need to do for others in your family, and you've just embraced this new marriage. Then I was able to get out there and start little by little. I mean, it was totally baby steps. It wasn't like I was ready to go out there and do 13 miles, 10 miles, whatever. I mean, I had to start with a mile, and then from there, just build myself up to have the confidence that I needed as Shawn, to be able to go a little bit further each time. And that was really, for me, it was miraculous, because I had never dealt with anything like this. I'm bullheaded. I just move across barriers and things. I've done that all my life. And now I'm being challenged by something completely different that I have absolutely no experience doing. And I just thought, I can do this.
You make a really good point, I think. I was talking with someone yesterday about, I think the phrase they used is, that diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, it just derails you. It throws you off the track you're on. And we talked some more about it, and they said, but eventually you can put yourself on a new track. And it sounds like that's exactly what you did. Taking elements of the old Shawn, as you put it, and figuring it out, how to move forward in a different way.
It's true. It's a metamorphosis. You have to take that old life that you had, and as all of us, I mean, in life, whether you have MS or not, we all progress. We get better. We take a couple of steps back when something comes into our lives that's just a little bit off kilter, and that's what makes us who we are. And I'm in the very beginning, I thought, as many of us, poor me, but I had to stop feeling sorry for myself, and I had to kind of reinvent myself. I at the time too, before I was diagnosed, I started getting into art. My dad's an artist. My mom's she's an artist of a kind. She's a pastry chef, and so I'm surrounded by all of these artists, and I kind of had to do that, where you paint a different canvas. You go through a canvas each and every day, a different draft. And so each and every one of us does that, whether we're conscious of that or not. And I had to reinvent a new Shawn, but it wasn't even a reinventing. It was more of, all right, this is now another stage of my life. And one of the things, whether you're painting a new canvas or you're finding your own big hike, it's so important to realize that, all right, yes, we can do this. We can find our old selves. We can mesh that old part of us with the new part, and we're still whole. And then just move forward with that.
Getting back to that big hike for a second, I'm curious, how do you train for something like that?
Let's see. Well, I've always been active, so I did a lot of CrossFit. One thing that I have to say is that anybody who knows me, I have absolutely no sense of direction. So for me, this was not only a big hike to challenge myself and to bring awareness and motivate others, but I had to figure out how to do this because I get lost in a box. So I did a lot of the physical part of it was not a big deal. It was getting through. It was the emotional part of, all right, what do I do if I get lost? That was the biggest part. And so what happened was we did a lot of research. My husband did all of the reconnaissance. He did a lot of the driving through the small areas where you couldn't get a car through, but he actually got through to meet me. And within 2 weeks of actually embarking on this hike, my partner bailed out on me, not my husband, but the person that I'm hiking with. So I actually had to do a lot of it on my own. And that was even more encouraging because not only am I battling through MS, but it's now enabling me to find my way. And every single day I walked for somebody who had MS. The days that I tripped, the days that I fell on the ground because I was so tired or I was mentally fatigued, and I just felt like, all right, you're lost again. This is an impasse in your life. I just thought of all of those people out there that weren't as fortunate as me, the people that have progressive MS. And it allowed me to continue for those people because I knew that I was more fortunate in a sense. It was very magical and inspiring because now it wasn't about doing it for me. It was find your way for others.
And that brings me to the very next question I wanted to ask you. What do you think you learned during that hike, especially where it sounds like you had a significant part of it where you were kind of doing it solo, unexpectedly? What did you learn?
I learned that I was a lot stronger than I thought I was. And I think most of us really minimize our strengths. And when I wanted to be an advocate or strove to be an advocate, it was to empower others with MS, for all of us to find that strength that each and every one of us have to continue battling this disease. And, you know, we can get stronger. There were times that it was so incredibly difficult because I had absolutely no idea where I was at. I had no cell phone at that time. I had no coverage to anybody. I had to figure it out by myself. And so I was struggling with not only the MS, but my own insecurities going through, everything and anything when you're alone, especially the fact that you have to rely on your strengths, being out there, your sense of smell, your sense of sight, hearing. There's nothing out there that is that's competing as we have now with your sense of aloneness or any kind of social media or anything like that. You're by yourself, and so you've got your own demons that you have to work through, and that's a good time to do it. And for me, it was a time to figure out that you'll probably live. I hadn't run across any bears, which were prevalent at that time, or mountain lions or anything like that, which were all around. You're going to do this. And my main thing was that if I could do it, anybody else out there could find their own hike and can battle their weaknesses. And that was the biggest thing for me is you're a lot stronger than you actually think you are.
So tell me, what are you up to today?
Oh, gosh. So many things. We're actually thinking about doing a hike in Scotland so that I could raise awareness for MS. Scotland, as many of us know, or maybe we don't, has the highest MS rate in the world. So I would love to do a hike across Scotland. I've just completed my investment banking security licenses. So I've gone through 3. I'm on my way to my 4th one as an investment banker. What else am I doing? My husband and I have a vineyard in Arizona, and so we're getting ready to harvest some grapes. So there's a lot on my plate, but it's it's all good. It's very encouraging.
When I think of your big hike, I think it's almost a perfect metaphor for living with MS. I mean, it wasn't easy. It threw things at you that you couldn't prepare for or even expect. It took you through an environment that could be pretty unforgiving. And let's not forget the bears and mountain lions. And completing that hike really served as such a great reminder that living with MS doesn't mean giving up. I think you're the absolute definition of an MS warrior. And I want to thank you for talking with me today.
Thanks, John. It really is. I mean, I think you've brought everything together. And for me, it's trying to. It was my hike, and all of us have our own individual big hikes, and that's what I really try to encourage others to. For me, it's there are times where I don't want to go out for a run, or I can't go out for a run, and maybe it's a stroll, maybe it's a walk, maybe it's just walking the vineyard with my dog, and maybe it's just doing my artwork. It's whatever your big hike is. That's the main thing. Whatever that challenge is, that's going to be each and every one of us. That's going to be our big hike. And it's not the sense of going out and walking 817 miles. That's me. But for somebody else, it's what's meaningful for that person. And I think that's the main idea that I'd like to tone, because that's really important. Sometimes people ask me, well, do you run? Well, yeah, but that's me. What do you like to do? So thank you so much. It's been wonderful to share my experience with you and the audience.
Well, that's going to wrap up this week's episode of Real Talk MS. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, I invite you to do so. You can find Real Talk MS wherever you find the best podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the new Google Podcast app. And if you have an Amazon Echo or Echo Dot at home, you can just say, Alexa, enable the Real Talk MS podcast. My name is John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.